1941. The world had been engulfed in war for some time, disproving the name formerly given to the war to end all wars. The bombing of Pearl Harbor had forced the United States to enter the conflict, and there was no turning back from the bloodshed that was yet to come. There were men laboring away on aircraft carriers, and men dropping bombs from high above onto German civilian streets. But now, those men were American. Noticeably absent from the combat were women. And yet back in America, women were doing their part to help the war effort in just as many ways as the men. Whether by conserving food, buying Liberty bonds, or by working in jobs that were left unfilled by men, women were a fundamental part of America's war success. Pilots were desperately needed during World War II. As many men as possible were needed for the ground warfare, which left a dire need for pilots that could complete domestic tasks, such as ferrying aircraft from factories to the bases in which they were needed. One exceptional group of women took this call and exceeded the expectations for their gender at the time. This group, the Women Air Force Service Pilots, better known as WASP. The establishment of WASP during World War II broke barriers for women in the military and therefore caused substantial changes to the Air Force. Initially, 2 separate programs were created that would eventually merge into one. At different times, Nancy Love and Jacqueline Cochran, both accomplished pilots, individually proposed ideas for a group of women who would work as pilots for the United States military. Women Air Force Ferrying Squadron, or WAFS, was led by Love and first submitted to General Hap Arnold in May of 1940. It was to consist of experienced pilots whose job would be solely to ferry aircraft. Women's Flying Training Detachment, or WFTD, was proposed by Cochran and was the more ambitious of the two. Cochran wrote directly to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt in 1941, suggesting a program in which women would do more than ferry aircraft, but additionally a number of domestic tasks. In the earlier years of the war, both programs were turned down. General Arnold, the very person that WASP was suggested to, argued that the use of women pilots serves no military purpose, but the success of a similar British program of women pilots disproved this. Only after the war progressed, causing a higher demand for pilots, were the proposals accepted. Although the United States military had used aircraft since World War I, these programs would mark the first time women had been accepted. WAFS, which was officially established in September of 1942, and WFTD, created directly after Pearl Harbor, were merged together into one program, WASP, on August 5, 1943. The job of WASP would be to ferry aircraft from factories to bases, instruct male pilots, and in the words of WASP Lucille Wise, perform flying duties in this country to relieve male pilots for overseas combat duty. Then it was time to find the girls, and there was no problem with that. Over 25,000 women applied, while only 1,879 were accepted. After the intense training regimen, 1,074 continued on and earned their silver wings at graduation. WASP Shirley Cruz describes that upon going back to her barracks, she would realize that other women had been sent home. She believes it wasn't that they couldn't fly, it's that they weren't learning to fly the Army way fast enough. And the girls were definitely learning the Army way. In a letter to her sister, WASP Adeline Adam recounts, "The whole setup and the very atmosphere is Army. We fall in and march to everything. They trained just as the men trained, marched just as the men marched, sang the songs the men sang. And they lived with just the same danger." For instance, Professor Kate Landeck from Texas Women's University depicts one of the most perilous aspects of the WASP job. The women would tow targets behind their planes, and Landeck explains,
"So you'd have these planes that would fly past a row of gunners on the ground, and the gunners would practice with live ammunition to learn how to shoot at a moving object."
Although no women died during this practice, 38 WASP in total gave up their lives for their country. During her time in WASP, Betty Buddy wrote to her family about the death of a former WASP, Margaret Oldenburg. Although the WASP were already paid very little, Buddy expresses that the women were all chipping in to buy floral pieces. But the deaths of other WASP would prove to be more costly, literally. Because the WASP program was not militarized, the government did not have to pay for a funeral or for the deceased to be sent home. Nor could the American flag be draped over the casket. Often, the money for this was paid for by the fellow WASP. When Mabel Rollison died in an accident while flying with her instructor, the money to send her body home was raised by the women, not the government. But this was not the only discrimination that the WASP faced. One must ask, if the women faced the same risks and went through the same daily struggles as the men, should they not be treated the same? And yet, again and again, the women were challenged with hurdles specific to their gender. One of their uniforms, called zoot suits, was built for a 250-pound mechanic and came in 3 sizes: large, larger, and largest, according to WASP Adeline Adams. But much more disheartening is the fact that the lifeline for pilots, their parachutes, did not fit the women. WASP Margaret Fellon Taylor recalls,
"But the parachutes were way too big. They weren't fitted to us. The force of the air and that speed and everything, why, that just rips stuff off of you."
But these obstacles were minor in comparison with what the women faced from men, the same American men with which they were fighting a war. WASP Jerry Nyman recounts a frightening experience in which he made a forced landing, only to discover that upon taking the engine apart, it had been filled with rags. In other words, she had been allegedly sabotaged. Rags, sugar, grass in engines, acid in parachutes, tires slashed, forced landing after forced landing. Time article journalist Olivia Waxman writes, pilot Jacqueline Cochran personally discovered sugar in the gas tank of a plane that had crashed, killing her colleague Betty Davis, but feared she and her colleagues would lose their jobs if they reported it as such. What could possibly rationalize this? Simply put by WASP Lorraine Rogers, some men didn't really feel that women had any business in a cockpit. But the WASP continued to successfully and faithfully serve their country, with a better graduation rate, lower accident rate, and lower fatal accident rate than their male counterparts. In 2 years, they flew 60 million miles, enough for 2,409 trips around the Earth. But that all ended in December of 1944. As the men began to return home from war, they were concerned that the women would replace them in the jobs they had left behind. So on October 1st, 1944, General Arnold wrote to the WASP that they were to be released on December 20th. He believed that the WASP proved that in any future total effort, the nation can count on thousands of its young women to fly any of its aircraft. The female pilots had aided immeasurably in establishing women's place in aviation, according to Cochran. The WASP had proven themselves, and proven the potential of all women. But according to WASP Lillian Yanely, they received no recognition as they left. She explains,
"Not a darn thing. It was told to us we would be leaving the base, and we hopped airplanes to get back home."
Until the 1970s, most of the WASP went about with their lives. Some tried to find jobs with commercial airlines, but according to WASP B. Haydu, she'd never heard no said in so many different ways. It seemed as though everyone had forgotten about their service, about the integral part that the women had played in the war effort. But in 1976, the Army announced that, for the first time, they would be training female pilots. WASP crews thought, hell, we did this in 43 and 44. They sealed the records of everything we did, and then announced they were going to teach women to fly for the first time. They made a big mistake. We came out of the woodwork. Through actions like writing mail, creating petitions, and establishing WASP Congressional Hearing Committee, the WASP lobbied Congress for a well-deserved right, their militarization, and they would receive it on November 23, 1977, with the signature of President Carter. They would finally be allowed to drape the flag over their casket. They would finally get the benefits that came along with their service, and they would finally be recognized as the veterans they truly were. Best said by a WASP herself, Pilot Wise praises today's female pilots. "I'm so impressed by what women pilots are doing today, especially flying into combat. They are proving once again that women can fly military aircraft just as well as men."